Hi, I'm Betsy Rosenberg, and welcome to a very exciting edition of Green TV. I am so pleased to introduce my next guest, Daniele Horton. Daniele is the founder and president at Verdani Partners. We're going to hear all about that. And she is currently leading sustainability efforts for 10 national and international real estate firms with over 4,000 properties managed across 720 million square feet, is that right, of diversified real estate portfolios. Very impressive. You also recently started a nonprofit organization to advance global sustainability, adoption to the built environment, something we're going to talk about. That's some 23 years of experience in corporate sustainability, real estate, and project management. So a really interesting intersectionality in your background. You're also a licensed architect, a LEED fellow. And if someone doesn't know what that is, I'm sure you'll tell us, LEED, but you are also a leader, LEADER, certified energy manager, Harvard graduate. Your degree is in sustainable development, and on and on. Also, one more thing, an adjunct professor at the University of San Diego, where you teach sustainable real estate. And you've been doing that since 2013. And you said you have children. So how you do it all, and you clearly get sleep because you look fresh and beautiful. How do you do it, and how do you do? Welcome to Green TV.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here and talking to you about this really, really important topic.
In this interview, I really look forward to hearing about how we can build better, and especially with President Biden telling us we're going to build back better. How do we do that? So let's go back to your foundation, which was in Brazil as a young girl. You connected with Mother Nature, and what happened next?
Sounds good. So I'll start a little bit, just giving a little bit about my background. I grew up in Brazil, and then I was in constant contact with nature. I had a vegan dad. I remember when I was 7, I think my environmental activist started when I was 7, and I kind of mobilized a group of young kids to help clean up a local river basin when I was on vacation. I think to me, when you see that something is wrong, I don't just sit there, like I want to do something about it. I want to help fix it. I worked as an architect for about 7 years, and then did a master's in sustainable development for at Harvard University. And I was able to take some classes at MIT, and there, like, some students were doing global carbon simulation models. And I think that was the biggest, like, eye-opening for me. And it was just terrifying because it's like, oh my gosh, we're leading ourselves toward extinction. We can't keep going on down that path. And I think, the worst part is that, a lot of the predictions that we did, like almost 17 years ago, I mean, things are happening much faster. So, we really need to kind of decarbonize our economy. We know what needs to be done, right? It's like, if your house is flooding and it's because you left your tap on, you can just keep taking water out, or you can just close the tap. I mean, the same thing with carbon emissions. We know that that's causing climate change. We need to stop pumping carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So I think for me, like when I was in grad school, I was just so like, oh my gosh, we need to do something. We need to act fast. I remember spending the entire time trying to network to go work for the UN or the World Bank. And I was the president of the student group. And my professors were all like, no, go to the private sector. And I, at the time, felt like a sellout. But they really, I think told me that, to the private sector, I'll be able to impact change faster by being an agent of change from within. So following their advice, I joined a real estate firm to be their head of sustainability, and kind of help green their portfolio.
And that was the beginning of this wonderful work you're doing to, I'm sure, green as many buildings, or educate about the need to build sustainably as you can. What are you currently working on? How far does your reach go?
I moved here alone, and as a Latina, minority, and an immigrant, I think one of my most proudest accomplishment has been starting my consulting practice for Verdani Partners and growing to a successful business. And I think we are a purpose-driven organization, and we're working. Our main drivers to kind of fight climate change to the built environment, and work with things that we think can scale, which is like large real estate portfolios. And then we want to work with cities and work with countries. I think, and I'm very proud that over 83% of our staff it's women and people of color. So after I had spent almost 10 years, greening Thomas Properties Group, which is a real estate firm that I worked, and learning from that experience, where we started with like one building at a time, then one portfolio at a time. I think with Verdani Partners, I wanted to kind of translate those lessons learned to other real estate portfolios. Because the thing is, like, even as an architect where you're working, you can spend years just working on one project. But like we can work, I mean, some of our portfolios that we work with have like 1,200 properties, 1,600 properties in like, like 50 different countries. So like the scale of impact by being with these decision makers can be so much faster. And right now, we don't have time for incremental improvements. We need to focus on aggressive, like bold solutions to fight climate change because we are running out of time. So, through my practice, like we're working with these large real estate portfolios to scale those efforts, not only nationally, but internationally. We're trying to focusing on grow in developing countries this year. We're hoping to actually start our first office in India and Brazil as well. And to be able to scale those efforts as quickly as possible. And, I think the built environment, 40% of our carbon emissions come from the built environment. So with my background in architecture and construction and real estate, that's where I felt like I could make the biggest impact. So we work with them to make those net zero commitments, to align sustainable development goals, and we embed ourselves in those organizations, build a team to really like implement those projects on an ongoing basis, and then track those efforts and report. And we want to be able to kind of share those lessons learned. I think it's, those big organizations, they have the funding to have people in my position to be able to, understand where their climate risks are, right? So they can make informed decisions. But we need to bring that kind of knowledge to the general population where they also can, understand these risks so they can make also more informed decisions about where they're going to buy homes, where they're going to live, how they need to prepare, their homes to deal with the impacts of climate change.
Exactly. And after these horrendous fires and floods and tornadoes and hurricanes, as I call them, all these extreme weather events, derechos, fire-nados. I live in Texas now. I was here for the snowpocalypse in February. Oh my God. There's so much damage everywhere. And people who have lost their homes they were saying, it seems until this last round of disasters, we'll build back, great community, a lot of support, we'll build back. And for those of us who know maybe they shouldn't, if they're right on the coast or in a flood zone, fire zone, and increasingly more land is in those areas, you want to scream, don't build, don't bother building back because more is coming, right? Don't you want to? And now that we do have whole towns kind of leveled by some of these events, what would you like to say to them? And how can you move a population away from the coast and away from, dangerous, like I'm from Marin County where there were very narrow winding roads through the hills. And my husband, who was in fire in the East Bay years ago, he refused to live up there. He said, if there's a fire, well, there's barely room for a car, let alone a fire engine, but you can't move Mill Valley, which is basically Hill Valley, where to somewhere else. Like once we have these dangers in mind, we realize how vulnerable we are. How much can people do? I know that's kind of a big question, but I guess that's a way to kind of just bring your work into the moment we're in. And then I have some more questions.
Yeah. I think I want to address something too before we get to like build back better. It's like, what's causing climate change too, but I mean, just very high level, because that influences, the decisions we're making in terms of like how we build our cities better. But I mean, one of the things in terms of like what's causing all of this, right? We have a carbon budget, and right now there's only a certain amount of carbon that we can emit to kind of have safe levels. And right now it's about like 1 trillion tons. And right now we already use half of that budget. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to cut our emissions by half by 2030, and then reach net zero by 2050. And with current levels, we're supposed to kind of use our emissions like in 9 years. And, to stay below 2 degrees, we'll be using about 26 years. And also to accomplish that decarbonization, electrification that we have to do with kind of how we build our cities, we also need renewable energy to supply about 70 to 80% of the power by 2050. So when we're thinking about rebuilding, right, and building back better, we can't, go back to like it's not just about rebuilding your home where you had your home and building back the same way you had before, right? We need to use this as an opportunity to really like do a reset and rethink, not going back to our unsustainable ways, and really rethink how we can rebuild our cities to help, to help and communities to decarbonize, to have more efficient, to make entire cities also less susceptible to floods and droughts and hurricanes and fires, right? So I mean, one of the things, um, for example, when you think about carbon emissions and how we build our cities and our zoning codes, like right now, a lot of our cities are like, single zone, very car dependent. For example, San Diego, where I am, 50% of the carbon emissions come from the transportation sector. So when we're rebuilding, we also need to densify. We need to, it's not like just about building those single family homes. And a lot of those single family homes are in these areas that might be more prone to floods or fires. So we need to kind of focus on our, where we already have existing infrastructure, on our cities. And the thing is like, right, to cut carbon emissions from transportation, we need to reduce our dependence on cars. We need to have more public transportation systems. So when you think about building back better, it's about where we build. A lot of these places that, homes are very susceptible to flooding, we shouldn't rebuild there. We need to move to other places. There are cities where they are actually providing incentives to help people relocate to safer areas. A lot of our coastal areas, I mean, there's some stats, for example, that some places don't even want to insure in those locations anymore, where where wildfires and floods are common.
Can you blame them? Can you blame them? Look what's going on.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't know how
Like,
they're going to survive the insurance.
yeah, insurance premiums have risen as much as 33%, in some parts of the country. And we have a place like more than 380,000 homes worth over 200 billion are at risk for coastal flooding, by 2050. And nearly 2 billion homes might become submerged by 2100. So it's really important that also when we're making these plans to rebuild better, is knowing how to build, is knowing where to build. And it's not only about the buildings themselves, but we need to think about regional risks. I mean, it's like you need to do those public-private partnerships where, the cities are working with, the private sector, and also like in some cases, protecting the entire coastal area. This is not, even if you build better where you elevate your home, but if the entire area is flooded, right, you're still living in an island situation. Like places like New York or Boston, they're starting to think about ways to protect the entire coastal areas. We're seeing some European countries where they have made these massive projects to protect the coastal area. So it's a combination of preventive, where we can lower carbon emissions to try to set us on a path for like higher resilience, but also preparing for those risks that we know are going to affect us. And we think, I think even like growing up in Brazil, the kinds of homes that we build and the materials that we use, like in the US, a lot of the homes are made of wood or things that, like, if you're in a fire zone, I mean, that can just, burn. And so using materials, even like adobe or like bricks, materials that are not as flammable, you need to think about what are the types of risks in your area to know not only where to build and maybe not go back to those high risk areas that are going to flood every year, but also like how you build your homes. How do you build them to be more resilient to the kind of key risks that you're facing in certain regions of the country?
I'm sure your clients are focused on sustainability or they wouldn't be working with you, which is terrific. But I remember, and I covered a lot of green buildings over the years, and learn about all this great stuff, efficiency, solar panels, but even way beyond that, materials. And when I would do interviews with, green building experts, I'd say, are people asking for green materials? And they'd say, no, that's the problem. So how important is education, educating, informing the public to know that this is a problem, which should be a lot more apparent now with these extreme weather events, but that this is something they can get, and this is something they prioritize. And I'm sure that number percentage has gone up, whether you're talking about building a house or putting together, a shopping mall or some kind of commercial building. people need to know that this is available, important, and is it still much more expensive to use green products and energy systems, or is that changing too?
I think it depends. I mean, depending on the material, yeah, it could be more expensive, but the certain material is more about choice. It's just making educated decisions about what materials to use. But I think going back to your topic of education, I mean, I teach, and I think it's one of the more rewarding things that I do, and that's also one of the cornerstones of our nonprofit organization, Verdani Institute for the Built Environment, Vibe. And this year, one of the books that we published was a children's book called like Earth Climate Heroes. I think if I show, it might be hard with my video, but like this is the book, and it's the purpose is to kind of bring a message of hope, but also teach kids about climate change and kind of what it's causing. How do we fix the problem? I think in the US especially, there's so much misinformation. I mean, I see even my students coming to a master's degree course that they don't really understand like how humans are the ones causing it, like our impact. It's just, there's so much. I think this is more prominent when I travel in other countries or even Brazil. I think people understand, like I studied climate change, like when I was a kid in school, and here I feel like our education system's failing us, where you're graduating these students from certain degrees that they need to have a better foundation. So through Vibe, not only kind of educating children, we're also working on a 12 series books about environmental social governance and sustainability, to kind of try to and we're going to have courses and the books and a lot of ways to kind of use that material to engage people. But even education with with our own clients, with communities, it's really critical, because you need to really understand, like with our own clients, even like we do those risk assessments, right? And it's really also helping them understand what are your properties that are going to be high risk for fires or for floods, and using that information to make decisions and to decide where you want to purchase buildings, where think investments that you need to make those buildings resilient. So I think that the society as a whole we also need to understand what's causing, right, so we can focus on solutions. And while we're having to deal with these climate change impacts, also understand what we can do to kind of make our buildings and communities safe.
And you talk about education. It is so important. I talk about we have an eco-literacy crisis in this country. Like so many, if you ask the average person, like woman on the street, because I used to do this in my, comings and goings, I would say there were 3 questions I'd ask, and this is probably 5 to 10 years ago. How many of you have heard of Bill McKibben, who is, a big climate leader, certainly within climate activism? Hardly one person out of 200, when I was giving a talk in my hometown, knew the answer to all 3 of these questions. He was the only one who knew really any of them. How many parts per million do you think of greenhouse gases do you think we have in the atmosphere right now? And what do you think the safe level is? Again, he was the only one who got it. And this was with, educated adults in Marin County, okay? They didn't know, and they weren't there. It was a bunch of speakers, so it's not like they just came to hear a green talk. So they were probably representative. And then the third was, so Bill McKibben, what's the safe level? And then how many of you know that we're in an extinction crisis, and which one it is and who's causing it? Us. And it just, again, but part of the problem is we didn't necessarily learn about it in school when I was coming up. And yes, kids are now taking more environmental studies. There must be climate courses. That's great, but we can't wait till they grow up and become, journalists, engineers, builders, because we have a window that's closing, if not like this much left.
Less than 10 years, we need to
right. And that's why I think media is so important. And because the news networks have failed to really make this a priority, not one program anywhere in the country on, climate and environmental solutions. Hello. And they've resisted, because I personally offered. That's not okay. Just thank you so much for making this connection, and we would like to have you back. Just have a couple of more minutes. So I'm really curious, as a Brazilian American, what you think about what's gone on in your country. Of course, Brazil is home to some of our biggest rainforests, and Bolsonaro is tied only with Trump in terms of idiocy and damage to our environment knowingly. And how difficult is that for you to watch? Because that's what keeps me up at night, that there are still leaders who have no business leading, actively, knowingly making it worse, burning up forests that I hear parts of the rainforest now, instead of sucking up carbon, they're emitting carbon.
I think it's hard for me because it's devastating to see, and it's hard when we have elect leaders that don't believe in climate change. I think that's one thing, if you have more education, people would not vote for leaders that don't believe in climate change.
Exactly.
Like our previous leadership, where they were trying to pull us out of the Paris Agreement, and developing countries, especially ours, that's home for so much biodiversity. It's really important for international organizations to kind of support those countries in kind of conservation efforts and protecting, their natural habitat, because sometimes, those communities also depend on these areas economically. I remember when I was in grad school, I remember pulling suitcase and suitcase of books about the Amazon, and I wrote a lot of papers about how to create sustainable development in the Amazon, because you can still, there's still a way that those local communities can profit from, kind of extraction from the plants without necessarily destroying it. And I think, to me, it's devastating to see, for example, so much of the rainforest being kind of burned out for cattle ranching, or and I think it's critical. Even when we were working on through the Paris Agreement, right? Some of these developing countries were like, oh, but you build all this economic prosperity by doing this exploitation of natural resources, and now you tell us that we can't. But I think there's ways that and there is funds allocated from these big agreements to support these developing countries, so that it's more valuable to keep these forests protected and intact than to tearing down. And so I think it's important to keep that kind of global pressure to support these developing countries that have these really important resources that are critical for our global community, in terms of kind of keeping our kind of climate stabilized. And so to me, it's really hard to watch. I think the fires that are happening also due to climate change, but there's other factors with that. To me, it was hard to watch, when anytime we have leaders that have such disregard for climate change. And so
Shouldn't be allowed to run for office unless you pass a basic science test or ask them. I was so mad when Hillary and Trump were debating. I wanted her to say, and ask him a question: how many parts per million, Mr. Trump, do you think greenhouse gases? And just to see the look on his face, we're not being strong enough in demanding that these so-called leaders, are not only ignorant, but arrogant about their ignorance. And don't they have children? Don't they have grandchildren?
Yeah, I think, I think on the positive side, we know what's causing, we know the solutions, right? We know we need to move away from fossil fuels, right? For us, even building infrastructure, switching to electric vehicles, eating less meat, right? We need to kind of support the utilities and kind of, powering our homes from renewable energy sources. We need to vote for leaders that believe in climate change, and plant a tree. There's so much we can do, have your garden in your backyard, try to do local food production, kind of supporting each other. Even communities, sometimes they're first responders, and understanding these risks and taking steps to prepare for those risks, so we could kind of protect ourselves, and so we can build back better in more resilient locations. I mean, the beauty of it is that there's so much we can do, right? Obviously, we don't have all the bold solutions we need to affect change, but we already have a lot of solutions. And so there's so much that we can do to be better and to switch to, I think now is a great moment for us to not go back to our old ways, right? When there's a storm, we can either drown or we can learn how to surf. And right now we need to learn to do things in a different way. And so that we can kind of go for a path of a higher resilience, thriving future, healthier future that, and kind of have the circular economy where we're not just taking things and going to a landfill, where we could have, work more like a forest, right? Like a tree, where we have that cycle. And so there's a lot of things we can do to be more sustainable. It's hard. It's so little time to talk about everything, but there are solutions out there, and we really need to work together, right? Alone, we're a drop, but together, if we all do our parts, we can make a big impact.
And I remember after Katrina hit, Brad Pitt went into the area and, devoted resources to building back better, greener homes, maybe moving to higher ground, if there is high ground in New Orleans. Do you think there's people planning to go down there now to, like, once people are over the shock, be exposed to people who are showing them how they can build back better? Will there be funds for greener rebuilds or moving people? I know that's a big question to end on with just a minute left, but like right now, it's where the rubber meets the road, right? The shift has hit the fan, and people are going to be wondering what the heck to do to have shelter.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of these places that are trying to rebuild, especially where no one wants to insure, there's heavily dependence on like FEMA insurance, or cities in some of these areas are trying to work with people to like not rebuilding some of those kind of more dangerous areas, and cities are learning too in terms of kind of rebuilding, their efforts to kind of rebuild faster in safer places and kind of safer homes. I mean, you really need to do like a joint effort to also make sure that people are not going back to certain locations. It's just I think even it's not something that even either those local municipalities can solve alone. So really need to do those kind of bigger partnerships and kind of creating policy too, because sometimes the private sector is not going to solve these problems, to kind of help prevent some of these things and create ways that we can create kind of more resilient communities.
And one of my slogans is, if you see something, say something, so you can save something, SAVE. And it may be as silly as, complaining about straws when they bring you your water with a plastic straw. Like, I live in Texas now, maybe, I don't know if it's worse here, but like, it's just plastic straw. It's not our biggest problem, although plastic pollution certainly is in the ocean, especially. But I speak up and I say, what makes you think I want a straw? I look like a grown adult. So I managed to get this far without drinking, my water or any beverage for that matter with a straw. We all need to be ambassadors, or I'll go into a hotel in the middle of summer in the lobby and they've got a natural gas fireplace going. I say, why is that on? Oh, ambiance, it was cool this morning. I'll say, are you crazy? I'm usually polite, but I say, we have a climate crisis. I'm only one person. Hopefully Green TV will allow me to reach more people with all my wonderful guests like you, but it's up to all of us, right? To have, I say, put on the green glasses and look to see where you can conserve, whether it's your home, your office place, your church, your synagogue. We all need to speak up. Environmentalists can't do it alone, clearly. And the mainstream media has failed in terms of programming on solutions. So it's in our hands, and hopefully that will change soon with Green TV. We have big plans to really reach millions of people who are concerned, love their children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, pets, parks, communities, whatever it is you love, it's all threatened. And that's not hyperbole, and that's not, unfortunately, overstating it. It's strangely, scarily enough where we find ourselves at. Danielle, thank you so much for being with us. I'm so appreciative that you joined us in this early launch stage of Green TV, made it possible, and we definitely want to have you back.
Sounds great. Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to come back. And thank you so much for having me today and for raising awareness about such an important topic. I'm really excited to see you kind of leading Green TV, and I'm really looking forward to watching all the amazing interviews that you're going to
And this is what I love doing most, is shining the spotlight on the experts who have wisdom that we need right now. So thanks again.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Green TV. We'll be back with another one.